from accrual basis to cash basis, how much that the city is actually paying for these services. So the operating activities is including all the revenue that you earn, net out all the payments that you pay for vendors and your employees, and then also some insurance claim. So for your water fund, the net cash provided by the operating activities is about like 468,000. During the current fiscal year, the city actually did purchase some capital asset of close to $900,000. The non-capital financing, which is the cash received from other funds of 137,000, cash paid to other funds 276,000. So total net of non-capital financing, $138,000 outflow, and then also the interest received is $12,000. So at the end of the day, the net change in cash and cash equivalents is dropped by $565,000, bringing it down from $11 million to $10.5 million. Looking at internal service fund, because of the operating, like trying to recover from prior years on all those deficit that's accumulated. So the net cash provided by operating activities increasing about like $1.6 million. The fund actually did spend some money on capital assets, $345,000, and then cash received from other funds is pretty much funding the capital asset, and cash paid to other funds $50,000. So at the end of the day, the change in cash and cash equivalents is about like 1.6, bringing up the cash from $6.4 million to $8 million. Okay. And then coming down to fiduciary funds. So as you recall, back in 2012, the redevelopment agency was dissolved, and there's an account like all the asset being transferred to the successor agency private purpose trust fund. So at the end of the day, we still need to account for this fund, and the city is required to make sure that these funds are properly dissolved and pay back all the debt, and then everything will go back to the state. So at the end of the day, you do have about like a $7.3 million deficit because of one of the bonded debt that you have. Now, nicely to say, because of things are moving to the successor agency, the bonded debt is not part of the city debt, but it's still a successor agency debt. Is an enabling, every year the city needs to file the ROPS, and all the payments coming from the RPTTF is going to pay for the bonds until it is completely retired. So the successor agency fund, at the end of the day, you still have close to $10 million, over $10 million of bonded debt for this one. The agency fund is acting as a fiduciary purposes, and this is not your money; it's somebody else's money. But the city is actually keeping track of the ins and outs. So at the end of the day, you do have about like $2.6 million for the asset that it got to pay out to the third party. So the city is only acting as an agent. So page 46. If you want to know a little bit more about the operating environments, the condition on the successor agency, for the fiscal year end June 30, 2018, you do collect about close to $1.2 million in the RPTTF funds, and then a little investment earnings, but really is paying down the debt, the administrative costs, and the interest charge, and then also the principal amount of the bonded debt. So the liabilities kind of like drop it down and then increase your net position from $7.9 million deficit to $7.3 million of deficit. Okay. Starting on page 49, it's the detailed footnote disclosure. In our report, it's not only about the numbers. The disclosure are very, very important because it's part of our evaluation. One of the assertions that we are looking at is the presentation and disclosure. So Note 1 and Note 2 is really spelling out who you guys are, and also talking about the significant accounting policy that the city adopt and how you account for stuff. Basis of presentation basically is talking about the different bases between the government-wide financial statement, the governmental fund financial statement, and the proprietary fund statement. And each of these financial statements have different measurement focus, the basis of accounting, and the financial statement presentation. But also at the same time, it gives you a lot of details about other accounting policies that you have, including cash and investment, your capital asset, your compensated absences, pension, OPEB, you name it, pretty much is a summary of what you adopted as a city. Once we have the summary of the accounting policy, we do spell it out, the note disclosure. I would like to also highlight a couple of the notes that you would like to see. Note 3 is detail out the cash and investments. So based on all your cash and cash equivalents and investment, they breaks it down into the demand deposit, how much that you invested in your what are your investment policy, what kind of investment that is allowed under this policy, the fair value measurement, the risk disclosure. Those are all identified in Note 3. Note 6 is another important one because the city do spend a lot of money in the capital assets. So you can see the additions, the deletions, the capital asset by asset class in Note 6. Note 7 is talking about the long-term liabilities, but I also, when we look at long-term liabilities, keep that in mind. Note 8, Note 9, Note 10 are very, very important because, as you can tell, especially the Note 9 from page 75 to page 880, it's really like 5 pages of note is only talking about one thing, net pension liabilities. And same thing for Note 10, other post-employment benefit is about another 4 or 5 pages long to describe your plan, describe the actuarial assumption that was being used. All the details are included in those notes. Note 14, commitment and contingency, not necessary everything is quantitative. A lot of things that a lot of times we communicate with your city attorney. We do receive attorney's letter confirming there any commitment or any contingency that cannot be quantified as of June 30, 2018 was disclosed in Note 14. Note 15 is another restatement note disclosure, and I said earlier, because of the implementation of GASB Statement Number 75 for the current year, it is not an accounting error. This is simply an accounting change that required the restatement, so which is approved and okay under the industry standard. So. May I ask the council if you'd like me to go through any footnote disclosure, because the footnote disclosure is very, very detailed, and if I need to go through about like 100-page footnote, it would take me more than 2 hours. So I'm open to the council members, and let me know which note disclosure that you would like me to go into detail.
Are there any council members that would like some detail on any particular note?
Good. So if that is the case, then I will go ahead and talk a little bit about the cash and investment the pension, and OPEB. Those are more key to the financial statement and is to your knowledge, and it's important because you need to know how much cash that you have and how are those being allocated in the financial statement. So starting on page 63. In order for you to flip between the financial statement, I actually did a summary table to summarize all the cash and investment balance as of June 30, 2018. So in your governmental activities, you do have about like $68 million. Your business type activities, $10 million, totaling $78.6 million. But you do have money that is not yours, including the successor agency money and also the agency fund money of $2.6 million. So the total amount of money that your city treasurer is handling is about $81 million. Of this $81 million, $7,200 is actually your cash on hand. Why you have cash on hand? Your cash register at the city hall, your off-site location, when you do need to keep some cash up front so that when you can make change when people come in and pay their fees on for services. But majority is really included in the deposit with financial institution. This is what I call the demand deposit, $34 million. And the city is allowed to make your investment. So there's about like $45 million in your investment portfolio. And then I can actually break that down on page 65, including the investment with fiscal agent. You can see your investment portfolio on page 65 and break it down by different by the fair value hierarchy. So besides LAIF, because LAIF they don't actually do a fair value measurement, so it's all done by at the state pool, so it's not subject to the fair value measurement. But all of the other investment that you have, including the U.S. Government securities, the municipal bonds obligations, the negotiable CDs, those are actually be able to find a fair values in the market on the same instrument. May not necessarily to be on the same date, but it's approximately the same date. So that's why we classify it as level 2 fair value. Because for those actually marketable security that you can actually actively trade in the market, those are called level 1 securities. But most of the city, it is really, really common. You do have a level 2 security. So it's pretty common. And then coming down to interest rate risk, and depending the longer you hold for the security, the more risk that you need to deal with interest rate fluctuation. So basically, you need to understand when the security is actually mature. So in the bottom part of page 65, they show you $15 million is less than 12 months, another $4.5 million between the second year, third year, $10.5 million, and then go all the way up to 60 months, and some of the security you do actually exceed the 60-month period. So page 66, when you actually invest, you do need to concern about the credit rating. You don't want to invest in some junk investment. So that's why you do have a minimal legal requirements on those ratings. So majority of your investments are actually rated A or above. And the other two that is not subject to credit rating is LAIF, which is the state investment pool, and the negotiable CD, which is pretty common that they are not rated because really secure. Yeah. So we do have a little bit more information about LAIF. So because of the significant amount that was being invested in LAIF of $7.6 million, we do, as required by at GASB, we do have a separate disclosure talking about LAVE and how much was being invested in the structured note and asset-backed security. So that's kind of complete the cash and investment. And I would like to mention we did actually obtain and confirm with custodian, confirm with your bank on all these amount when we perform our audit. Okay. Note 6, capital asset, on page 69. So the first page is what we call is all the things that's happening in your governmental activities. So when the city adopt the budget, thinking about the line on capital outlay, this is the schedule that we looked at. So during the fiscal year, the city actually did spend about close to $2 million in your CIP infrastructure, and then also buying machinery and equipments for $2.1 million. So total $4+ million in that is being invested by the city in the capital outlay. And then also for the fiscal year end June 30, 2018, the city actually needs to record the depreciation. So the depreciation of for close to $500 million at cost. Your depreciation for the fiscal year is about like $7.3 million, which is really reasonable. Break it down, how much was being charged to different department. It's on page 70, the top table. So the $7.3 million of depreciation was allocated to different departments. And then the bottom table, the table in between, business type activities, so which is your water fund. So there's not a whole lot of activities in the water fund. So this year you do purchase some machinery and equipment of $908,000. The current year depreciation is $632,000. So at the end of the day, your capital asset recorded in your enterprise fund was $4.1 million. So these are big ticket items. Going to note 7, which listed out your long-term debt, and I'm happy that I don't see any bonded debt in both your governmental activities and the business type activities. The majority of the liabilities, as I said earlier, is still your pension and other post-employment benefits. So I'll jump into those and we'll talk about it. And page 72, the fiduciary fund. The change in the long-term liabilities really rests with your successor agency. So you do have the 2014 tax allocation bond, and is still making payments. So for the current year, you pay for fiscal year end June 30, 2018, the successor agency did make about $485,000 as a principal payment. So the detailed schedule of the bonded debt. So the upcoming year, 2019, you are expecting to make another close to $900,000, of which $500,000 is for the principal, $374,000 for the interest for those. So starting on page 74. These are your retirement pension footnote disclosure, which is a hot topics that we discuss. Page 74 is actually giving you a breakdown on what's included in the deferred inflows, deferred outflows, and net pension liabilities. As I said, deferred outflows, it's just like your prepay. The biggest item in there is your pension contribution made after measurement date. Keep that in mind when we prepare the report for fiscal year end June 30, 2018. The pension liabilities is actually measured as of June 30, 2017. There's a 1 year's lapse because the actuary would not be able to catch up with all the valuations. So GASB actually did allow for 1 year's lapse and using a measurement date as of June 30, 2017. So what happened when we when the city actually make payments for the current fiscal year, is not using it to net against the pension liability. So that's why I say the deferred outflow resource is just like your prepaid. So the very top item in the table, $3.1 million and $5.4 million, with respect to the miscellaneous plan and the safety plans on the pension contribution made during that fiscal year. But it's because of made it after the measurement date, we put it as a defer. And then you see another big change is the change of assumption. Also wanting to point out that the CalPERS actually did change the assumption during the year, especially in the discount rate dropping from 7.65 to 7.15 when they value the total pension liability. So that's why you see a big gigantic deferred outflow resource recorded in the recorded in your financial statement. So total deferred outflow resource $22 million. Your net pension liability, keep that in mind, is still valued as using a discount rate of 7.15%. So for your miscellaneous plan, $36.6 million. For your safety plan is $60.3 million. The deferred inflows is really the some minor variances between the expected and actual experience. For your miscellaneous plans, $922,000. Your total pension expense between miscellaneous and safety plan, $5.8 million. Okay. And then going to page 75, really talking about the detail of the plan, what the city is providing to your employees. So I'm not going through in detail. And page 76 is a very important page, showing you the breakdown of how many employees are actually paid by the city under the current plan. The miscellaneous plan, total active employees, 170. 95 was being transferred or terminate employee, and then as of this point, you do have about like 277 retired employee and currently enjoying the benefits from CalPERS. Safety plan, current active employee 114, transfer or terminated 60 employees, and then the retiree 174. So total is 348 people for your safety plan. The assumption that was being used by CalPERS actuary is actually listed on in the bottom table. So using a discount rate of 7.15%, the inflation 2.75%, like the salaries increase is really based out of the experience from the city. And they're still expecting a investment rate of return of 7.5 when they actually perform the 2016 valuation and roll forward to the 2017. We did talk about the discount rate because a lot of people are still trying to figure out, well, is the discount rate really legit? I was talking to the deputy chief actuary at CalPERS last week, and he basically talked about there's different scenario. There's no guarantee that the discount rate is not going to drop, but also at the same time that the actuary at CalPERS is still confident that the plan is going to make 7% long term in the next 30 years. So they gave us an analysis, and then also as a auditor, I think we will still be able to see that it will happen in the next 30 years, but also at the same time, we will be paying a lot of attention to the investment earnings in the next couple of years, because even for the current fiscal year, we challenge CalPERS. Your rate probably is not sustainable. So that's why the discount rate is always a hot topic at CalPERS. And even take a look at the on page 78. This is the strategic allocation on different asset class, and between 1 to 10 years, and then also from 11 and and plus years. So that is one of the challenge that we challenge the CalPERS actuary when we look at these numbers, because none of these numbers actually exceed the 7%. And a good portfolio is the private equity. And even private equity is only making about like 6.63%. So at the Cal Society CPA, we have a committee of about like 40 professionals within that committee, and we are constantly challenge CalPERS on this decision. So when we challenge about this position, also at the same time they need to concern about the funding, the funding mechanism that they have from CalPERS, because that will have a big impact to all the constituents within the community. So this is always a challenge. And then coming down to 79, just in case. GASB understand this is a estimates based on the fluctuation of the investment, the use of discount rate, but also giving the reader some feeling about what if the investment portfolio didn't make the 7% and drop by 1%, what will be your liabilities? Okay. If it drops by 1% and if you use the discount rate of 6.15%, your liabilities, instead of $96 million between the two plans, can go all the way up to $140 million. But also vice versa, they give you some good news. If the investment actually do great and hit the 8% long-term expected rate of return, the liabilities can drop it down to $54 million. So, but this, like for financial statement purposes, we are recording at 7.15%. Okay. Then looking at Notes 10 on page 81. So we talk a lot about deferred inflows and outflows, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time in that scenario. So other post-employment benefit is really a new thing this year. So you do see the total liabilities is about like $47 million. Break it down between the governmental activities and business type activities. So also your actuary, like let's go to page 82. Total participant is 262 for active members and 305 for inactive members, using the following discount rate, 6.25, because they can see the expected rate of return is about like 6.25, the inflation 2.75. They still use a lot of CalPERS data when you evaluate the between CalPERS and the pension and OPEB. So trying to be consistent between the two. And then also on page 84, you'll also see a very similar analysis. If the discount rate dropped by 1% or increased by 1%, what are the differences? And the differences for this for OPEB purposes, it's not big. So if the discount rate dropped by 1% at 5.25%, your liabilities goes up to $52 million. And then vice versa, if it goes well, $43 million. But also you do see the healthcare trend rate. If the rate actually dropped by 1%, actually your liabilities also drop by a couple $1 million to $42 million. If the healthcare trend rate, the cost keep going up by 1%, your liability will go up to $52 million. Okay. So going down to page 91. Now you are able to see the budgetary comparison schedule. So the budgetary comparison schedule for the general fund is presented on page 91. The storm drain, the sewer and storm drain special revenue fund on page 92. And then also on page 93, you talk about those budget and budgetary accounting. And then page 94, 95, 96, 97, those are schedules relating to pension and OPEB. And I highly recommend you to follow this trend because it will build up to a 10-year schedule when the accounting when the pronouncement being adopted for 10 years. So that's why for pension you can see 4 to 5 years of information, and OPEB you only see 1 year of information in there. So starting on page 101, which is your supplementary information, I'm not planning on going through in detail by fund because it's all you can. It's really self-explanatory. But starting on page 173 is your stat sections. Even the sections is unaudited, but also give you a really good information about what has happened in the past 10 years. You can see the financial trend, revenue capacity, the debt capacity, the demographic and economic information, and some other operating informations that you have. So that's kind of conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Council? Any questions for Mr. Poon? Russ?
Well, thank you very much for the trip down memory lane and all the detailed information. It's a very complex situation overall, obviously, and so for me, this walkthrough was very beneficial, and I appreciate you taking us through that and giving us your insight and explanation of what's in the report and what sections of the report are more critical than perhaps others. And I don't necessarily revel in the thought of what things outside of our control can do to impact our budget, but we have to know that, so I also appreciate that information. I don't really have any specific questions. For me, taking the time to go through that, I've made some notes to go back and revisit some of those sections with the insight that you shared with us in your presentation.
And as you said, one of the key, even though it's in the unaudited sections, which is the required supplementary information, those schedule of contribution pay a little bit more attention to it because of the drop of discount rate. The rate is going up pretty much. The city is going to pay more than double of what you pay now in the next couple of years. So pay a little bit more closer attention to the contribution made to CalPERS and start to have a plan for it.
Thank you.
I too would like to, Carly, do you have anything to ask?
I have a question.
So on that page, let me see here. This would be on page 55, the second paragraph, for the purposes of this, it talked about how the city pulls cash in the investments.
Correct.
Right? Mm-hmm. So I understand how that works. You go up to page 37 of the document. That's going to be 53 of the PDF. And you have, so this is our water department, right? So our current assets, the total assets for the water department, business type activities, the first column, we have $10 million, $10.5 million.
Correct.
Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so then you scroll down to page 38. And here you have the investment income of $21,000. So my question is, how are we getting a rate of return of 1% on the water investments? I mean, you just look at inflation was about 2.8 for that year, so we really lost money because we should be keeping up with investment with the inflation. That kind of stuff is scary for me to see. And you don't have to answer it now necessarily, but
We'll have to take a look.
that is something I'm concerned about.
Understood. Well, I'll have to go back and double check because one of the things that we look at is the analysis and the weighted average of the cash balances at the end of each month to determine some months you may not necessarily to have enough cash for it. So that may be the reason, but I'll have to double check for it.
And a very thorough answer is what I would like, because we have monthly reports that come out to us.
Sure.
And our rate of return is low, but it's usually our low is about like 1.1% to 2.
I'll have to go back and double check.
Okay, I would appreciate that.
And if there are no other questions, just to comment, Mr. Poonen, with regards to this, going through this thoroughly as you did, it's almost too bad that this is the time just before our budget is adopted, because there's some things in here that, kind of brings to your attention, and what do we do now? So.
That's a good point. I think one of the things that takeaway is obviously is Ken talks about the liability as it relates to whether it's OPEB or PERS. I mean, you see firsthand the issues with respect to what we have to deal with when we're talking about our budget. So the timing in terms of having this conversation about the budget, you can see how that impacts our operation when we're doing our budget. So very good point.
I have one more question. So, as you go through these types of things, you absorb and you come up with different questions. Are we to direct them to you?
Yes, please send them to me.
Okay, Sarah, was there anybody who wanted to speak on this item?
Yes, Pat Gregory. Good evening. Thank you for this presentation. Last time I asked about 10 questions and I contacted Mr. Lopez. I didn't get answers from Mr. Lopez, but some of my questions have been answered here. But I think the most important thing that I got out of this last hour and a half is that we're below the 20% reserve that we're supposed to have. That was never brought up by anybody. That's a shocker. I thought there was some type of resolution or requirement that we stay within that 20%, that we have that 20%. We don't. We haven't had it since 2018. So if anything, that's got to be really, really looked at when you do the budget. We're already under the 20%. Next, the question that I have on this audit, there's two portions, and you mentioned the management portion, which is unaudited. But those financial statements are entirely different than the audited financial statements. The numbers are completely different. Example, in the unaudited version that he suggested that we look at from a management perspective, Measure U was $7 million. Yet when you look at the audited version, Measure U is $11 million. So when there's such a big difference between the unaudited numbers and the audited numbers, I have to question why. What numbers do I look at? Do I look at the management perspective, or do I look at the audited version? I don't know. I don't even know if there's an answer, but the other question I have is that I did point out that on page Roman numeral 5, the auditor said that they were rendering an opinion about the fiscal year June 30th, 2017, and I imagine that's incorrect?
That was a typo on the transmittal letter, not the audit letter.
Okay, so on page 5, so that was corrected. Okay, so that was the other questions that I had. you again sort of answered, but on page 63, 66, and 68, do the auditors actually review the bank statements?
Yes.
You look at every single one of them?
We look at the June 30, 2018, and then also we select a couple months.
Oh, sorry. So the $45 million in investments, my question is every statement verified? Not just a sampling, like I guess some of the invoices are sampled. I'd just like to know if every single statement on that is reviewed. And, okay, that's about it. But I really need to know which numbers are correct on this audited report. The management portion on pages 9 and 10, or the audited portion, because it's kind of silly having two sets of numbers. Thank you.
Want to get back to you regarding the review of the bank statement. Is one of the requirements that under the audit procedures, we look at all the bank statement as of June 30, 2018 to make sure that the $81 million is actually currently exists and properly classified in the financial statement. So we do send out confirmation to banks. We do test, like during our interim phase, we actually did test the bank reconciliation. We pulled a couple months of the reconciliations to look at, so that we are able to confirm that the internal controls is in place, so that to make sure that the bank reconciliation, you do have proper processes, so that we are able to rely on the internal control at year end to pull the reconciliation and tie it out to the general ledger. So in response to your questions, we do look at the bank statement pretty much 100% and agree to the reconciliation, and also send out confirmation, including lay and investment in with fiscal agent. So
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I can answer the other two questions. The first question was about the 20% reserve, and Mr. Poon stated that we were at 18.73. It's all in how you look at it, because you have to remember that Measure U is a general tax. It is not a special tax. So for auditing purposes, our auditors cannot treat those funds as a special revenue, because they're not. So when they look at the total expenditures, they include Measure U. But if you recall last year or the year before, we were specifically directed to separate the two and not count any Measure U expenditures or revenues as part of that reserve. And so when you take those expenditures out, we are at that 20%.
Yeah.
We're just above the 20%.
Legally, we're not allowed, so the auditors aren't allowed to single out a general tax from the rest of the general fund revenues that we receive. So it's all in the same pool, if you will. Not a special tax.
And as far as the Measure U revenues, the error that's in the management discussion and analysis that's in the first section, I own that mistake. When you look at so many numbers and you're at crunch time trying to finish things, it's inevitable you're going to have mistakes. I would trust the audited numbers and not what's in the MD&A. We make our best effort to not make mistakes, but we're human and we make them. And I made that mistake.
Again, thank you, Mr. Poon.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. It's like 15 minutes before item 2. What would you like to do?
I can
Start?
start with the
Go ahead,
budget
start.
and finish
Okay.
up later on
Let's go ahead and
this
do
evening.
that.
Okay. So good evening, Mayor and members of Council. You have the presentation that Sarah's passing out. That is a printed version. You should have a PDF of the PowerPoint in your inbox as well. So that's the color version. I apologize that your copies aren't in color, but I printed this out about 10 minutes before 5, so I was in a rush to get this taken care of. So what you have before you in the agenda backup is the proposed 1920 budget. And so I wanted to go over a few of the high-level things, provide a recap to the public as well as the council as to the steps that we've taken to get to where we are now. You'll recall in March 2019, the direction was given from the city manager to prepare a rollover budget. So at that time, that's when the management team began the process of pulling personnel numbers, expenditures, and began the process to prepare the preliminary budget for fiscal year 1920. The Budget Ad Hoc Committee during that time has actually met in January and February and March, a couple meetings in April, as well as 2 meetings in May, and the most recent one was on May 27th that the mayor and Councilmember Cooper were a part of. The Measure U Committee has met 2 times. They met on April 29th as well as May 28th. Council workshops were held on March 27th and May 14th to provide direction on some of the policy items that I used, as well as the management team, to prepare the preliminary fiscal year 1920 budget. Also, too, during this process, as I mentioned before, all expenditures and revenues were reviewed with management. So in terms of whether it's department heads or division managers that have revenues in their operations, we reviewed all those. And so what you have before you is the most accurate and up-to-date information related to those items. So based on the May 14th council direction, these 4 items were discussed. You'll see that item number 3, which was the lowering of the 20% reserve, was something that the council unanimously did not want management to explore. So with that being said, the lowering of the 20% reserve or any use of the 20% reserve was not included in the preparation of the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget. The other items, in terms of the amount that is allocated for special events, we haven't made any adjustments to that moving forward, but we're happy to have those conversations as we move forward during this budget presentation. You'll also notice that item number 1, a use of Measure U funding to support public safety in the general fund through the use of Measure U, was included in this proposed fiscal year 1920 budget. In addition to that, council provided direction on a number of other items that are included in the staff report. In the backup, I won't get into details related to those, but they are included in the presentation and the staff report as well. As I mentioned, the Measure U Oversight Committee has met. They did meet 2 times on April 29th as well as May 28th. Their letter is attached to the backup. Just to summarize the letter, they have come to the conclusion that the expenditures that are listed in the Measure U plan that's in your proposed fiscal year 1920 budget does meet the intentions of Resolution 4703 and 4731. They also recommended that the city use Measure U reserves to increase the visibility of public safety operations. And they also recommended that the city explore the use of midterm financing for capital purchases. The way that they're budgeted for in the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget is a complete outright purchase of those items and not a financing mechanism to purchase for those items. So some of the high-level items that are included in the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget, some of the items that have been included in the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget, some of these you'll recall that we went over this in the discussion in May. It includes a facilitator for strategic planning and allocation for that, recruitment costs for the permanent city manager, cost for Measure Z implementation, classification and compensation studies as stated in the public safety MOUs, cost increases for PERS across the agency, increases for contracts for software maintenance, increases in contract costs for the Simpson Center, new positions including a deputy city clerk, HR analyst, management analyst. I have a note to the right that states the new positions in HR and finance are as a result of consolidation of existing positions with no net increase in number of personnel. New budget allocation for overtime in police and fire. We can get into that a little bit later. Compensatory time expense in PD in years past. This line item has not been included in the budget. The expenditure is there, so we felt that it was appropriate to include that so that the council knew what was more accurate in terms of the budget for police and fire, so we included that in there. A $1.2 million allocation for Measure U funding for public safety in the general fund. Cost increases for public safety MOUs, 20% emergency reserve, and education and training budget levels have been restored. You'll recall that in fiscal year 18-19, the current fiscal year that we're in, that item was reduced to help balance the budget last year. There are also a number of items that have not been included in the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget, and I've summarized those for you in this slide. Cost of living adjustments for non-safety personnel have not been accounted for in this budget. Classification and compensation studies for non-safety groups, that cutoff, are not included in this budget. Replacement of telephone system, a purchase of agenda management system is not included. Private security for library or city hall is not included. Consolidated grant management is something that the council has mentioned in previous times that is not included in this budget. Proactive mobile home inspection staff, you'll recall that prior to Deanna leaving, we talked about this item and that it's not going to be included, unfortunately, in this year's budget. An economic development program is not included in this year's budget. Additional capacity in code enforcement, as well as additional contract capacity, I should say, in human resources to help in public safety recruitments. So when we talk about some of the challenges that we have, including bringing on public safety personnel, we're really doing it with the existing staff that we have prior to even the passage of Measure U. So we're adding additional burdens in terms of additional asks of them, but we haven't increased any staffing to help through that. So that places additional burdens on them. As you recall, we do have a number of vacancies throughout the agency, so it's not just public safety, but it's across the agency that we're having vacancies, which is placing a strain on human resources. So you'll recall that on May 27th or May 14th, we talked about the projected $5.2 million deficit. We've been able to reduce that $5.2 million deficit and present you a balanced budget. What are the methods that we employed to get there? I've summarized the bulk of those here. We've eliminated 5 non-safety vacant positions. These are positions in public works, in the civil and in the engineering department, as well as positions in HR. We've consolidated some positions, as well as a position in facilities maintenance. We've utilized $891,000 of fund balance from equipment replacement, primarily from the police and fire department equipment replacement fund that has been accruing a balance over the course of the last few years. The purpose of that fund was to obviously replace equipment in their operations. We've utilized approximately $315,000 of fund balance from facilities maintenance, This includes projects that have not been started in numerous years. This goes back to some of the capacity discussions that we talked about. So for these projects that haven't been completed in the last few years, those became prime opportunities to utilize that to help close that budget gap. We utilized $500,000 of fund balance from Workers' Compensation Fund, primarily based out of actual costs versus projected costs. Utilization of $200,000 from the liability fund. We've accounted for a 5% vacancy savings factor across non-safety departments. As I mentioned, we've got numerous vacancies across the agency. The budget assumes that the start of July 1, 2019, that every position in the budget is filled. We know that that's not the case, so we know that we will have some vacancy savings as a result of people that leave the agency, current vacancies that we currently have, and the time in getting those individuals brought on board to the agency. Additionally, we've also accounted for vacancy savings in the police department. We currently have 19 vacancies in the police department on the general fund side, and we anticipate hiring 10 officers, resulting in 9 vacancies. And so this number was as a discussion and some conclusions with the police chief. So this is a realistic and honest number as to the number of individuals we can hire this year. So even though we may hire 10, we got to keep in mind that any reduction as a result of retirements, laterals to other agencies, or disciplinary action, not meeting probation, will have an impact on the net positions that we add. So this is currently the number of vacancies that we have as of today, but based on the demographics, individuals that retire from the agency, we can probably anticipate that we're going to have more than 19 vacancies as a result of that. So even hiring 10 officers, we're up against a battle in terms of getting that number and getting the boots on the ground for that. As we did in this current fiscal year, we've eliminated the $530,000 allocation for equipment replacement in fiscal year 1920. We haven't allocated anything outside of Measure U to replace any equipment for this fiscal year. And then finally, we've utilized $1.2 million of Measure U funding to offset costs in the general fund. The bulk of costs related to retention and attraction measures have been absorbed primarily by the general fund. Increases in overtime and personnel costs, as we talked about, PERS increases in public safety have been primarily absorbed by the general fund, and so this allocation will help offset those costs. So Mayor, I know it's 7 o'clock right now, so based on what the council elects to do, I can continue or go a little bit later, just based on what the council desires.
We probably have about 5 more minutes on this particular piece, right?
I've probably got about 15 more slides.
Okay, what's the pleasure of council? Come back to it. I'm sorry. Yeah, why don't we, you need a 5-minute recess then? And we'll come back to it. Is that good? Okay. So we'll recess for 5 minutes before we start the regular session and finish up with this particular workshop.
Okay.
Thank you.